So we live in an age of molecules and brains. We tend to think more than any other age that if we can understand the inner workings of our brain and the inner workings of molecules, we can understand everything. And few scientists have put together as cohesive a picture of how that all works than Gordon Shepherd has with flavor and olfaction. But there's another way to look at the world, and that is to say, to look at the world, and look at the world as we understand it through culture. And that's perhaps a complementary narrative, perhaps a competing one. But the wonderful thing about universities is that they have different departments that approach questions, the same questions, in different ways. So now we're going to hear from David Howes, an anthropologist, for another perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and thank you especially to the organizers of this extraordinary conference, which in bringing so many different disciplines together will advance our understanding of flavor in another whole way. Now, I wrote the other book on smell, or I was a co-author anyway. It's a book called Aroma, The Cultural History of Smell, written by Constance Claassen, who's a cultural historian, myself, an anthropologist, and Anthony Sinnott, a sociologist. No psychology anywhere in it, although it was actually sort of supported by the Olfactory Research Fund, which had a psychological kind of orientation. Now, I think that the imprimatur of that book, it's almost as good as an endorsement from Charles, okay? But it's in the same vein, but the book was picked up by a Brazilian publisher. We were invited to Rio and then also Sao Paulo for the launch. And on national television, we were interviewed about the book. We were known as the Canadians that go around smelling Sao Paulo. We were interviewed about the book by Juan Cabral, who was a very prominent talk show host. As we came on to sit down for the interview, he sort of came to me and embraced me in a huge bear hug and inhaled me. And this is actually a Portuguese custom, or in Portuguese there's the word cheiro, and that means to embrace someone and to inhale them. And this is very different from the handshake, which actually keeps you at a distance. It's a form of greeting that we find in many parts of the world. The nose kiss would be another. But what's interesting about it is precisely that sort of emphasis on olfaction. Now, he said he did that in order to find out if I was really qualified to write the book. Did I have the right smell? Unfortunately, I passed the test, so I was relieved, and I was also quite astonished to be embraced in this way on national television. Now, we've heard about the idea of flavor as being located in the brain, and indeed, Gordon's account is a very eloquent one of the way in which there are various processes of a neurological nature that unfold in that space between the sense organ and the brain. As an anthropologist, I have a different focus which complements this, but takes us in the opposite direction, I would suggest, between sense organ and world. So what I'm concerned with is that space, that interval between sense organ and world. And I'd like to suggest that that is the domain of culture. I'd like to suggest also that that is the domain of flavor. So I'm going to suggest that actually flavor is in the world, but in a very definite kind of way. And let me just read you one quote that articulates this position that I'm trying to argue here about the perception of flavor and indeed perception in general. So this is a historical account, and actually it's inspired by some words of Karl Marx, who said, "The forming of the five senses is a labor of the entire history of the world down to the present." And the critical theorist Max Horkheimer expounded on this as follows: "The objects we perceive in our surroundings, cities, villages, fields, and woods, bear the mark of having been worked on by human beings. It is not only in clothing and appearance, in outward form and emotional makeup, that humans are the product of history. Even the way they see and hear is inseparable from the social life process as it has evolved over the millennia. The facts which our senses present to us are socially preformed in two ways: through the historical character of the object perceived and through the historical character of the perceiving organ." So whereas in the neurobiological account of perception, Perception is conditioned by the character of the sensory organ, and it is sort of the CNS that is involved, and we're talking about information processing. This other perspective suggests that the sensorium is a historical formation, which would not be denied by anybody in biology, but that sets up a particular focus for analysis. Perception on this account that comes from Horkheimer begins at the edge of the humanly constructed environment and is conditioned by the social pre-formation of the senses. So there's a really important difference here, I think, between the neurobiological account of perception that focuses on, again, the route from the sense organ to the brain, and this historical account, this cultural account that looks at the interval between sense organ and world, which I would like to suggest is the domain of culture, and above all, the domain of practice. So we're looking not so much at the organ of perception as the practices of perception in what I'd like to say in what follows. And when we look to this space that I'm describing, we are looking above all, and we're sort of bringing back an archaic notion of really sort of sense perception, which holds there to be an indissociable unity between the sense organ, the object, and some kind of medium. Some kind of medium. I didn't hear a lot about the medium of perception in the account that comes out of neurobiology. It sort of falls away because of the emphasis I want to suggest on nerves. But this idea of medium and mediation is fundamental to this idea of the social preformation of the senses. And above all, we're talking here about some of the respects in which culture shapes perception. And that shaping is given in the idea of the mediated sensorium. So the senses are mediated in the most elemental sense. And here I'm quoting Caroline Jones. She observes, the human sensorium has always been mediated. Without the medium of air or water, the anthropoid ear finds it impossible to hear. Okay, so again, the medium is essential to the process of perception. That's that interval between sense, organ, and world. The senses are also mediated in the technological sense. For example, various communications media can be understood as extensions of the senses, following my hero, Marshall McLuhan. And indeed, from the papyrus to the smartphone, you've got various ways in which the process of perception has been externalized. That it doesn't just go on in our brains because those technologies are doing the perceiving for us. The most insidious example of that is the MP3. The only reason it's able to actually get those tracks compressed in such a fashion is that it drops out lots of the music. So you're hearing a very edited version of the music when you listen through an MP3 device. Now, maybe that doesn't matter, but your hearing has been thinned and replaced by a device in that case. And can you ever appreciate the fullness of the music? Now, most of us don't have ears sort of attuned enough to be able to tell the difference, but I just put it there. But that's another sense in which our perception is mediated. And finally, the senses are mediated or enculturated in the social sense that I just sort of suggested by reference to the work of Horkheimer. Let me then give you an example of really what I think can best be described as a cosmology that, in this case, has to do with Hindu India. I'd like to compare the experience of taste in India with, say, North America. Now, taste in India, rasa, is highly elaborated on multiple levels. So you have a sensory model which really revolves around taste in a way that you could say our sensory model revolves around vision. For example, the Sanskrit gustatory vocabulary consists of 6 terms, whereas the English taste lexicon has only 4, or arguably 5 if you count the Japanese loanword, unami. Ayurvedic medical theory, one of the medical traditions of India, recognizes a range of post-digestive tastes. Okay, now, hearing that, you might think of heartburn. You might think of acid reflux. But in fact, this shows it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the power of taste, and we'll come to that in a moment. And actually, the idea of sort of tasting things post-digestively. Okay, so that we're going to see how the process of incorporation begins with the preparation of food and actually doesn't end until these post-digestive tastes are concluded. Now, Ayurvedic medicine also holds that the virtue of a medicine resides in its flavor, okay? Whereas the taste of a drug is simply unimportant in Euro-American pharmacopoeia. The taste has no more implication than the color. These are just incidental features, whereas the virtue of a medicine, typically these are herbal medicines, is understood in Ayurvedic medicine, as in Chinese medicine, to actually reside in the flavor. What are we missing about flavor, given that we don't recognize any of the wisdom of these medical traditions in that respect? Emotional states, of which there are 8 according to the Schatzker, are classified as savors in India. Okay, so you have 8 rasa, you have 8 savors, which are these 8 emotions. Now, English speakers assimilate emotions to feelings. You can use the same word for both, and they're more inclined to identify emotions by color. You can be red with rage or green with envy. So I'm just trying to bring out how these are very different sensoria, very different sensory universes. Audiences in India want to taste the rasa of a performance. Okay, so they go to a performance of a play or of a piece of music, not to see the play or hear the concert, but rather to taste the rasa of the performance, to experience the emotions, to actually taste the performance by the actors who are expressing various emotions through their gestures and so forth. Taste differences are so important in India that they determine an individual's rank in the caste system. Your rank is defined by reference to what you eat. And there is a whole gradation of diets whereby the purest diet is a vegetarian one, purely vegetarian one. The lowest is a meat-eating one. And that whole gradation and that jockeying for position between castes reflects how gustation is the ordering principle of the social order. And not only is the social order grounded in these dietary distinctions, but the very order of the universe, the very order of the cosmos, is held to depend on regular gustatory exchanges between humans and gods. Okay? Indeed, there's the ritual practice of prasad, and in which one makes an offering of food to the deities, and then once they have consumed its essence or spirit, you eat the leftovers. And this is very convenient. It means when you make a sacrifice, you can still get to eat whatever it is that's been sacrificed. But the understanding is that because its spirit or essence has been already consumed by the gods, well, you've actually sort of fulfilled your obligation to propitiate them, and you are just eating the leftovers. In this regard, there are interesting dimensions of a spiritual flavor here, and maybe sort of to understand what that spiritual flavor is, we would be rather challenged in the West. Now, how does the cultural complexity of taste, such as we've been describing, where taste sort of forms the basis of what I'm just suggesting is a gustatory cosmology, express itself in Indian cuisine? Well, curry is the national dish. And there's perhaps no more complex dish in the world. Interestingly, Charles Spence, in a paper that we'll actually be discussing at another conference a little bit later next week, has said this of curry: "I am always reminded of the guides for making a good curry. While a good curry does indeed contain 20 to 30 or more herbs and spices, so much more chemically complex than many other dishes, it has to be said that the chef has failed in his or her job if the taster is able to detect individual elements, i.e. the spices, within their tasting experience." Okay? So there has to be a blend such that you experience the curry as a unity. You shouldn't be able to discriminate any individual flavors in it. I'd like to suggest that there's a cosmological explanation for that phenomenon as well, because within the Hindu universe, the world is understood to be infused with a unity of spirit under a plurality of forms, a unity of spirit under a plurality of forms. And the unity is provided by Brahman, but there are many forms that Brahman takes, like Shiva and Shakti and so forth. So all the different gods are ultimately one. And just as sort of you have this idea of the oneness of spirit in this idea of Brahman, so through a curry, you should be able to taste the underlying unity of Brahman. This is a very different understanding of just what the taste complex involves. From there, an example of a gustatory cosmology, let me turn briefly to introduce you to a thermal cosmology. So there's neurology and there's cosmology. And this is the cosmology of the Tzotzil of the Chiapas highlands of Mexico, which could be described as a thermal cosmology. And indeed, their society is grounded in certain thermodynamics. Just by way of example, the sun is referred to as our father heat. Okay, so the sun, which is both a visual and a thermal source, what is privileged, or what is actually, and actually there's supposed to be an image on the screen, maybe we could have that up. What is actually sort of foregrounded is the heat. Beyond that, the directions are referred to in terms of heat. So the east is rising heat, and the west is waning heat. The social order has a thermal dimension. Men are hot, and they become hotter with age as a result of the fact that they become more and more ritual leaders in an important sense. Women are cold, and that complements the men. You need both hot and cold in the universe, but especially in the time of childbirth. And for that reason, a newborn, is smoked as its first sort of act. The idea being that you have to counteract the effects of all the cold. Plants are classified by temperature. Maize is hot, potatoes are cold. Now, how can you talk about plants in terms of temperature? Well, maize grows above ground, potatoes grow in the ground, the cold underground, and that accounts for the difference. Significantly, all of the elements of ritual amongst the Tzotzil include candles and tortillas and cane liquor, and what these all involve is heat. And indeed, that heat is involved either in their production, you have to cook tortillas, or else they give off heat when you consume them. Cane liquor, very, very hot. And also candles. So again, with candles, I mean, we would see a candle surely as a visual symbol, but the significant thing in the Tzotzil universe is precisely that it's a thermal one. So here, what you find is a sort of complementarity to the way in which certain sensory properties are appreciated within the cultural framework of the two cultures. Now, what has Mexico given to the world in terms of cuisine? Well, chilies, which produce a burning sensation and which indeed have acquired a kind of following, a kind of interest that is global as a result of the way in which they sort of introduce us to a very novel sensation. But to me, it's significant that given the emphasis on heat amongst the Tzotzil, you would find this to be the case. Now, what I'd like to point to is the way in which food is a medium of exchange, and this echoes David Sutton's point. It passes between people. People share food, and they share the sensations that arise from it. And that's why we need to look to some of the ways in which food combines different qualities in a significant way in order to understand sort of fully the way in which food is a medium of exchange as well as a source of nutrition and a source of flavor. Now, there was supposed to be an image on the screen. Perhaps we could have that now. It's a sort of an image called The Creation of Birds by Remedios Varo. And I guess it's not going to show up. Okay, well, Well, what I was going to conclude my talk, and I'm hoping we'll get the image, but we'll see. I wanted to sort of introduce you to a narrative, to bring out the significance that we're talking about in terms of this whole idea of heat, but also of chilies in the cuisine of Mexico. And I was going to sort of summarize a short story called Under the Jaguar Sun by Italo Calvino, which I actually used in a book that I edited, which is otherwise consists of pieces by social scientists. But Calvino's piece so beautifully captured what it's like for a European or an American to sort of enter into the food world of Mexico, that I included it as an example of sensory ethnography. And just briefly, this is an excerpt from the short story. The true journey, as the introjection of an outside different from our normal one, implies a complete change of nutrition, a digesting of the visited country, its fauna and flora, and its culture, not only the different culinary practices and condiments, but the different implements used to grind the flour or stir the pot, making it pass between the lips and down the esophagus. This is the only kind of travel that has a meaning nowadays, when everything visible you can see on television without rising from your easy chair. Okay, so this is his idea of actually ingesting another country in order to be able to properly have the experience of it. And he dismisses the idea of going to a Mexican restaurant in Montreal or wherever as being, that's just too artificial. It doesn't convey the gist of the experience. And I'm not going to go into the story because I want you to discover it for yourself, but it is truly a gustatory exploration of the universe in the tradition of sensory ethnography. And if you read it, your next trip to Mexico will not be the same. Okay? You will, sort of, I can assure you, want to go on the same kind of journey as Calvino. Well, this image was to have been showing from the start, but it's okay that we've got it now. And I just have one more minute that I want to sort of wrap up a few things. This image actually contains the key to my whole talk, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. I just wanted to say as well that what my talk points to is a way in which, not so much neurogastronomy, but the area that is called sensory analysis or sensory evaluation in food science. And it's the food scientists that are responsible for designing many of the foods that we consume. That science has certain kinds of tests that are done, that are sensory tests. One is the hedonic value of a foodstuff, and the other is the discriminatory test, which will tell you whether, what margin or what difference is detectable in a given food sample. I'm going to suggest that one of the things that is missing, seriously missing, from the conventional food science approach is any concern with the semantic. What I've tried to do is bring out some of the dimensions of the semantic, the meaning that the senses have for people, the meaning that sensations have for people. And I would argue that this is truly the domain in which future research in food science needs to explore. They need to hire more anthropologists, okay, in order to be able to use the discipline of sensory ethnography. And what those new breed of researchers will come to this with is the sensibility that is so beautifully sort of expressed in this painting by Remedios Varo called The Creation of Birds. It's not a very good reproduction, I apologize for that. Remedios Varo was a Spanish surrealist painter. She fled Spain to escape the Nazis and the fascists and went to Mexico. And there she lived out her years until 1963 and painted a whole series of extraordinary canvases. Canvases that teach us how to use our senses both in apprehending the world and in creating the world through the medium of painting. And this painting might be thought of as a metaphor or sort of a model for how we might think of food as well. You have an owl-like figure seated at the desk, drawing a series of birds. The owl-like figure has a stylus in one hand, and that is connected to a violin on the chest. And in the other hand has a prism, which is focusing a moonbeam and breaking it up into its various colors onto the paper in front of the figure. You'll also notice a kind of alchemical vessel with a tube that goes out through a window to the night air. And that is apparently sort of drawing in the night air, drawing in the air, and then transmuting it into the paint, which you'll see on the palette near where the hand of this figure is taking the paint in order to be able to draw the birds. Now, notice how the birds sort of fly off the paper. They actually become living. That's the creation of birds. And that reflects the fact that we experience birds through multiple senses. And in order to draw a bird, you also have to gather multiple senses together. Now compare that model of the interaction of the senses and the sensitivity to the interaction of the senses with the next slide, if we may have it. Okay? I don't have the little thing to change, but there is a next slide, and it's called the strain gauge denture tenderometer. And the strain gauge denture tenderometer, there it is, a frightening apparatus designed in 1957 by Aaron Brody at MIT. And this device is to measure mouthfeel. Okay? It's a set of human teeth that can sort of perfectly imitate the kinds of movements that the mouth goes through, and then it generates graphs. Mozzarella cheese has a graph like this, steak has a graph like that. And in this way, what has been attempted is a kind of scientization of subjectivity. Okay? All of these sensations are notoriously subjective, but here it was going to be objectified. It was going to be mechanized. And then you don't have to worry about all those organoleptic characters anymore. You don't have to have human panels. The food industry can just use this information to design things. And if I could have the next image, please. It shows Aaron Brody actually, isn't it clear there? Actually sort of brushing the teeth and taking personal care of this rather sort of extraordinary machine. Now, this is an understanding of flavor, or one of the components of flavor, namely mouthfeel, that is totally mechanized. And one of the things that I'm conscious of it is, and this is what Gordon was pointing to as well, is that, well, this tenderometer doesn't have any ears, so it can't actually appreciate the crispiness and how the sound of the sort of foodstuff might be. And the point that I think we've seen repeatedly is how food is a multidimensional phenomenon, flavor is a multidimensional phenomenon. With that excluded, typical of the analytic mindset of the scientific world, you're not going to be able to get at this important dimension. The last slide, and the end of my talk, is another piece by Remedios Varo, Still Life Reviving. Now, we're used to the tradition of the nature morte, the idea of fruit or game dead, depicted in some kind of scene by a Dutch painter or what have you. But here, Remedios Varo is giving life back to the still life. The fruits become planets, and they are circling in a kind of constellation. And they are sprouting seeds which fall to the floor, and you could see that those seeds are in turn becoming other plants. And this dynamic vision of food is the one I think we have to recover, or else we're going to be clenched in the teeth of that tenderometer forever.
Thanks.